The morning sun cast long shadows across the London streets as Prince William stepped out of his car near a shelter inn. It was December 2005, and the young prince was just 23 years old. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he approached the building that would change his life forever. This wasn't just another royal visit. This was the beginning of a journey that would span 2 decades and touch countless lives. William had been visiting homeless shelters since he was a child, following in his mother's footsteps. Princess Diana had first brought him and Harry to see the harsh realities of life on the streets when he was just 11 years old. Those early experiences had planted seeds that were now beginning to grow into something much larger than anyone could have imagined. As he walked through the doors of that December morning, William was greeted by Sarah, a young woman about his own age. Her eyes held stories of struggle, but there was also hope there. She had been living on the streets for 6 months after aging out of the care system. Her story was one of many that William would hear that day, but it was Sarah's words that would stay with him long after he left. "Your Highness," she said quietly, "most people look through us like we're invisible. Thank you for actually seeing us." Those words hit William like a physical blow. Here was someone his own age, intelligent and articulate, who had fallen through the cracks of society. As he listened to Sarah's story, he learned about the complex web of circumstances that had led to her homelessness. She had no family support, no financial safety net, and no one to turn to when everything fell apart. The system that was supposed to protect vulnerable young people had failed her completely. William spent hours at the shelter that day, talking to residents, staff members, and volunteers. Each conversation revealed new layers of the homelessness crisis. There was a veteran who had served his country with honor but couldn't find work or housing when he returned home. There was a mother of 2 who had fled an abusive relationship and found herself with nowhere to go. There was James, barely 18, who had been kicked out of his home for being gay and had been sleeping rough for weeks. The stories were heartbreaking, but what struck William most was the resilience and dignity of the people he met. These weren't the stereotypes often portrayed in the media. These were real people with real dreams, facing circumstances that could happen to anyone. They weren't looking for handouts or pity. They wanted opportunities, support, and most importantly, to be treated with basic human dignity. The CEO of walked with William through the facility. He explained how the organization worked to provide not just emergency shelter, but comprehensive support to help young people rebuild their lives. They offered education programs, job training, mental health support, and help finding permanent housing. It was a holistic approach that recognized homelessness as more than just a housing problem. "We can't solve this by just putting a roof over someone's head for a night," explained. "We need to address the underlying causes and give people the tools they need to create stable, independent lives." William was fascinated by this approach. He had grown up in a world of privilege where basic needs were never a concern. The idea that young people could find themselves with literally nowhere to go was both shocking and motivating. He began asking detailed questions about the root causes of youth homelessness, the gaps in support systems, and what could be done to prevent young people from ending up on the streets in the first place. As the day progressed, William found himself drawn into deeper conversations about policy, funding, and systemic change. He realized that while charity and individual acts of kindness were important, they weren't enough to solve a problem of this magnitude. Real change would require addressing housing policy, mental health services, support for care leavers, and employment opportunities for young people. The prince also learned about the hidden nature of much youth homelessness. Many young people didn't sleep rough on the streets where they would be visible to the public. Instead, they couch-surfed with friends, stayed in unsafe situations, or found temporary shelter in places that put them at risk. The official statistics only captured a fraction of the true scale of the problem. One conversation that particularly moved William was with a young man named David who had recently moved into his own flat with help. David had been homeless for over a year, but with support and training, he had found a job and was rebuilding his life. His transformation was remarkable, but what struck William was how close David had come to falling through the cracks completely. "I was invisible for so long," David said. "People would cross the street to avoid me, but the staff here saw potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself. They didn't just give me somewhere to sleep. They helped me remember who I was and who I could become." As William prepared to leave that evening, he felt fundamentally changed by what he had experienced. The weight of the stories he had heard, the faces of the young people he had met, and the complexity of the challenges they faced had opened his eyes to a crisis that was largely hidden from public view. He realized that his position as a member of the royal family gave him a unique platform to bring attention to this issue and advocate for change. Sarah, the young woman who had first spoken to him, approached him as he was leaving. She had something in her hand, a small, handwritten note. "Your Highness, I wrote this for you," she said. "I know you meet a lot of people and might forget us, but I wanted you to know what today meant to me. For the first time in months, someone listened to my story without judging me. Someone saw me as a person, not just a problem." William took the note and read it later that evening. In simple but powerful words, Sarah had written about her dreams for the future. She wanted to go back to school, find a job helping other young people, and one day have a family of her own. She wrote about feeling forgotten by society, but finding hope in the work that organizations like were doing. She ended with a challenge that would echo in William's mind for years to come. "Your Highness, you have a voice that people will listen to. Please don't let us be forgotten again. Please help people understand that we're not choosing to be homeless. We're just young people who need a chance to prove what we're capable of." That night, William couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the conversations he had had, the statistics he had learned, and the faces of the young people he had met. He began to understand that this wasn't something he could just visit once and move on from. This was a calling that demanded long-term commitment and action. The prince began researching everything he could about homelessness, youth services, and housing policy. He read reports, studied successful programs in other countries, and reached out to experts in the field. What he discovered was both encouraging and deeply troubling. There were innovative solutions being developed and tested around the world, but there was also a lack of coordination, insufficient funding, and political barriers that prevented these solutions from being implemented at scale. William also began to understand the interconnected nature of the problems that led to youth homelessness. Young people leaving the care system often had no family support and insufficient preparation for independent living. Mental health services were overwhelmed and underfunded. The housing market made it nearly impossible for young people to find affordable accommodation. Educational support for vulnerable young people was inconsistent. Employment opportunities for those without stable housing were limited. The more he learned, the more determined William became to make a real difference. He realized that his royal status could open doors and create conversations that might not otherwise happen. He could bring together politicians, business leaders, service providers, and most importantly, young people with lived experience of homelessness to work on solutions. Over the following weeks, William continued visiting shelters and services across London and beyond. Each visit reinforced his commitment and deepened his understanding of the issue. He met young mothers struggling to keep their families together, teenagers who had aged out of care with nowhere to go, and young people fleeing violence and abuse. He also met incredible staff members and volunteers who were working tirelessly to make a difference, often with limited resources and support. One particular visit to a night shelter in the middle of winter left a lasting impression. William arrived on one of the coldest nights of the year to find young people queuing outside in freezing temperatures, hopping for a bed for the night. The shelter only had enough space for 30 people, but there were more than 50 young people seeking help. Watching staff members having to turn away vulnerable young people into the freezing night was one of the most difficult experiences of William's life. That night, he made a promise to himself and to the young people he had met. He would use every tool at his disposal to ensure that no young person would have to sleep rough because of a lack of safe, appropriate accommodation. It was an ambitious goal, but William was determined to make it a reality. The prince began working closely with and other organizations to understand how he could most effectively contribute to their work. He didn't want to just be a figurehead who appeared at fundraising events. He wanted to be actively involved in developing solutions and advocating for policy change. This meant learning about the complexities of homelessness services, understanding government funding mechanisms, and building relationships with people across the political spectrum who could influence change. As 2005 drew to a close, William reflected on how much his life had changed since that first visit too. He had discovered a passion and purpose that went beyond his royal duties. He had found a cause that demanded everything he could give and more. Most importantly, he had made connections with young people whose courage and resilience in the face of incredible challenges had fundamentally changed how he saw the world. The young prince knew that this was just the beginning. The scale of youth homelessness was enormous, and the solutions would require sustained effort over many years. But he also knew that change was possible. He had seen it in the faces of young people like David, who had been given the support they needed to rebuild their lives. He had witnessed the incredible work being done by organizations and he had felt the power of simply treating homeless young people with dignity and respect. As William looked ahead to 2006 and beyond, he was filled with determination and hope. The fight to end youth homelessness would become his defining mission, a 20-year journey that would challenge him, inspire him, and ultimately change the lives of countless young people across the United Kingdom and beyond. The boy who had been taken to see homeless people by his mother had become a man ready to lead a movement for change. The seeds planted during those early visits with Princess Diana had grown into something powerful and transformative. William understood that ending youth homelessness wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for the fight ahead. He had found his purpose, and he was determined to make sure that young people like Sarah, David, and James would never have to face homelessness alone again. The rain hammered against the windows of the small community center as Prince William sat across from Emma, a 19-year-old who had been sleeping in bus stops for 3 weeks. It was March 2008, and William had been quietly visiting homeless services across the country for over 2 years. The media rarely covered these visits because William insisted they remain private. He wasn't looking for publicity. He was looking for understanding. Emma's story was becoming all too familiar to William. She had left care at 18 with high hopes and a small flat provided by the local council. But when the support worker visits ended and the reality of living independently hit, everything began to unravel. Bills piled up, her job at a local ended when she couldn't afford bus fare to get there consistently, and eventually she was evicted. Within 6 months of leaving care, Emma was homeless. "I thought I was ready," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They taught me how to cook and clean, but no one taught me how to handle a crisis. When my housing benefit got delayed and I couldn't pay rent, I didn't know who to call or what to do. I was too ashamed to ask for help until it was too late." William had heard variations of this story dozens of times now. Young people leaving the care system were being set up to fail. They received minimal preparation for independent living and virtually no ongoing support once they turned 18. It was like pushing someone into deep water after only teaching them to float in the shallow end. The statistics were staggering. William had learned that care leavers were significantly more likely to experience homelessness than any other group of young people. They were more likely to struggle with mental health issues, more likely to end up in the criminal justice system, and less likely to continue their education or find stable employment. Society was failing the most vulnerable young people at the exact moment they needed support most. After his conversation with Emma, William met with the staff at the center. They explained the impossible position they found themselves in. They had limited funding, overwhelming demand, and were constantly having to turn away young people who desperately needed help. The staff were passionate and dedicated, but they were fighting a losing battle against a system that wasn't designed to prevent homelessness. "We're like a Band-Aid on a broken bone," said the center manager. "We can provide temporary relief, but we can't fix the underlying problems. We need proper investment in prevention, in education, in mental health support, and in affordable housing. We need a coordinated approach that follows young people through their transition to independence." William was beginning to understand that solving youth homelessness would require more than just providing emergency shelter. It would require fundamentally reimagining how society supported vulnerable young people. This realization was both daunting and energizing. The challenge was enormous, but so was the opportunity to create real change. Over the following months, William continued his education about homelessness by visiting services in Manchester, Glasgow, Cardiff, and dozens of smaller towns and cities. Each location had its own unique challenges, but the core problems remained consistent. Lack of affordable housing, insufficient mental health support, inadequate preparation for independent living, and a benefits system that often created more barriers than it removed. In Manchester, William met James, a 20-year-old who had been homeless on and off for 2 years. James was intelligent and articulate, but he struggled with anxiety and depression that had gone undiagnosed and untreated for years. He had been in and out of various accommodations, but without addressing his mental health needs, he couldn't maintain stable housing. "It's like being trapped in a cycle," James explained. "I can't get my head right without stable housing, but I can't keep housing without getting my head right. Every time I try to break out of it, something pushes me back down. James's situation highlighted another crucial aspect of youth homelessness that William was learning about. Mental health and homelessness were deeply interconnected. Many young people experiencing homelessness had underlying mental health conditions that made it difficult to navigate the complex systems designed to help them. At the same time, the trauma of homelessness itself could trigger or worsen mental health problems. In Glasgow, William visited an innovative program that was taking a different approach. Instead of waiting for young people to become homeless and then trying to help them, this program identified vulnerable young people early and provided intensive support to prevent homelessness from occurring in the first place. They worked with care leavers, young people struggling with mental health issues, and those facing family breakdown to provide the practical and emotional support needed to maintain stable housing. The results were impressive. The program had reduced youth homelessness in its area by over 40% in just 3 years. Young people who received early intervention support were more likely to continue their education, find employment, and maintain stable relationships. The program cost a fraction of what was spent on crisis interventions and emergency accommodations. William was excited by this preventative approach, but he was also frustrated by how difficult it was to get such programs funded and expanded. Short-term political thinking and departmental silos meant that innovative solutions struggled to get the long-term investment they needed. Money was available for crisis interventions, but prevention programs were seen as a luxury rather than a necessity. During this period, William also began learning about the international dimensions of youth homelessness. He discovered that this wasn't just a UK problem. Young people were facing housing insecurity and homelessness in countries around the world. Different countries had developed different approaches, and there was much to be learned from comparing strategies and outcomes. Finland had virtually eliminated rough sleeping through a housing-first approach that provided immediate access to permanent housing, rather than requiring people to progress through various levels of temporary accommodation. In Australia, innovative programs were working with young people at risk of homelessness while they were still in school, providing early intervention before problems became crises. The more William learned, the more convinced he became that ending youth homelessness was not only possible but achievable within a reasonable. What was needed was political will, sustained investment, and a coordinated approach that brought together all the different services and systems that touched young people's lives. William began to use his position more strategically. Instead of just visiting services and learning about problems, he started convening meetings between different stakeholders. He brought together service providers, government officials, business leaders, and most importantly, young people with lived experience of homelessness. These meetings were informal and confidential, allowing for honest conversations about what was working and what wasn't. One particularly significant meeting took place in late 2008. William had invited representatives from across the homelessness sector to discuss the possibility of a coordinated campaign to end youth homelessness. The room was filled with people who had been working on these issues for years, many of whom had never had the opportunity to sit around the same table. The conversation was electric. Ideas bounced around the room about prevention programs, policy changes, public awareness campaigns, and innovative housing solutions. Young people who had experienced homelessness spoke powerfully about what had helped them and what barriers they had faced. Government officials shared insights about political realities and funding mechanisms. By the end of the meeting, there was a sense that something significant was beginning to take shape. William had used his convening power to create connections and conversations that hadn't existed before. People left the meeting energized and committed to working together in new ways. One of the young people at that meeting was Alex, a 21-year-old who had become homeless after aging out of care, but had successfully rebuilt his life with support from a local service. Alex spoke passionately about the importance of involving people with lived experience in developing solutions. "You can't solve homelessness without listening to homeless people," Alex said. "We know what works and what doesn't because we've lived it. We know what it feels like to be invisible, to be judged, to be written off. But we also know what hope feels like when someone believes in you and gives you a real chance." Alex's words resonated throughout the room. William realized that any successful campaign would need to put the voices and experiences of young people at its center. This wasn't about doing things for homeless young people. It was about working with them as partners in creating change. Following this meeting, William began developing relationships with young people who had experienced homelessness and were now in a position to share their stories and insights. He learned about the importance of trauma-informed approaches, the value of peer support, and the need for services that treated young people with dignity and respect. One young woman who had a particularly profound impact on William was a 23-year-old who had been homeless multiple times but had recently completed a university degree, had experienced family breakdown, mental health challenges, and periods of rough sleeping, but she had also experienced the transformative power of getting the right support at the right time. "Homelessness taught me about resilience," said during one of their conversations. "But it also taught me about the importance of hope. When you're sleeping rough, hope is sometimes the only thing that keeps you going. The services that worked for me were the ones that saw my potential and invested in my future, not just my immediate crisis." Insight about hope became central to how William thought about the homelessness issue. Too often, services focused on managing crisis rather than building futures. Young people needed immediate safety and shelter, but they also needed to be able to envision and work toward a different life. This required a fundamental shift in how society viewed homeless young people, from problems to be managed to people with potential to be realized. By the end of 2008, William had visited over 50 different services and spoken with hundreds of young people, staff members, and stakeholders. He had developed a deep understanding of the complexities of youth homelessness and the interconnected nature of the solutions needed. He had also built a network of relationships with people across the sector who shared his commitment to creating change. The prince was no longer the young man who had first walked into 3 years earlier. He had become an informed advocate with a clear vision of what needed to happen. He understood that ending youth homelessness would require changes to housing policy, improvements in care leaving support, investment in mental health services, reform of the benefits system, and a cultural shift in how society viewed and treated vulnerable young people. William also understood that his role was unique. As a member of the royal family, he could convene conversations, attract media attention, influence political leaders, and inspire public support in ways that others couldn't. But he also knew that real change would come from the grassroots, from the young people, service providers, and communities who were doing the daily work of supporting vulnerable young people. The foundations were now in place for something much bigger than individual visits or charitable donations. William was ready to launch a comprehensive, coordinated campaign that would fundamentally change how the country addressed youth homelessness. The next phase of his journey would be about turning vision into action and bringing together all the pieces needed to create lasting change. As 2009 began, William felt a sense of anticipation and determination. The learning phase was coming to an end, and the action phase was about to begin. The young people he had met had trusted him with their stories and their hopes. Now it was time to honor that trust by working to create a future where no young person would have to experience the trauma and isolation of homelessness. The conference room in Clarence House was unlike any royal meeting space had ever seen before. Around the oval table sat an extraordinary mix of people: government ministers, CEOs of major corporations, directors of homeless charities, and most remarkably, 5 young people who had all experienced homelessness firsthand. It was September 2010, and Prince William was about to launch the most ambitious campaign of his life. At the head of the table sat a 22-year-old who had been sleeping rough in London just 18 months earlier. Today, she was finishing her social work degree and working part-time at the very shelter that had once provided her with emergency accommodation. Her transformation was remarkable, but what made her presence at this meeting truly significant was William's insistence that she co-chair the session alongside him. "Ladies and," William began, "we're here today because we share a common belief that in a country as wealthy and resourceful as ours, no young person should have to sleep rough or live in unsafe conditions simply because they have nowhere else to go. But more than that, we believe that every young person deserves the chance to build a meaningful, independent life." The campaign William was launching was called Future Hope, and it was unlike anything that had been attempted before in the fight against youth homelessness. Rather than focusing solely on providing emergency accommodation, Future Hope aimed to create a comprehensive system of support that would prevent young people from becoming homeless in the first place. And for those who did experience homelessness, provide the intensive, wraparound support needed to help them build stable, independent lives. Took over from William, her voice steady and confident as she addressed the room full of powerful figures. "I want you all to understand something," she said. "When I was sleeping rough, I wasn't lazy or looking for handouts. I was a young woman who had faced circumstances beyond my control and fell through the cracks of systems that were supposed to catch me. What saved me wasn't just getting a roof over my head. It was having people believe in me when I couldn't believe in myself." The room was completely silent as spoke. Her words carried a weight and authenticity that no government report or charity presentation could match. This was the power William had discovered in putting young people with lived experience at the center of the campaign. Their voices cut through bureaucracy and statistics to reveal the human reality of homelessness. Over the previous 2 years, William had worked with a team of experts, service providers, and young people to develop the Future Hope model. The campaign had 3 core components: prevention, intervention, and transformation. Each component was designed to address different aspects of the youth homelessness crisis, but they worked together as an integrated system. The prevention element focused on identifying young people at risk of homelessness before they actually became homeless. This included care leavers, young people experiencing family breakdown, those struggling with mental health issues, and young people leaving the criminal justice system. These groups would receive intensive support, practical life skills training, and ongoing mentoring to help them navigate the transition to independent living successfully. Sarah, a program manager from, explained how prevention worked in practice. "We've learned that the period between 16 and 25 is absolutely critical," she said. "Young people are making the transition from childhood to adulthood, often without the family support that most of us take for granted. If we can provide intensive support during this period, we can prevent homelessness from occurring in the first place." The intervention component kicked in when prevention hadn't been possible or hadn't worked. Rather than the traditional approach of moving young people through various levels of temporary accommodation, Future Hope provided immediate access to stable, private accommodation combined with intensive support. Young people worked with dedicated support workers to address the underlying issues that had contributed to their homelessness, while building the skills and connections needed for long-term stability. Who had been homeless for 6 months before entering the program, described his experience. "When I first went to the housing office, they offered me a place in a hostel with 30 other people, sharing bathrooms and kitchens with no privacy and constant noise. It felt like being warehoused rather than being helped. The Future Hope program gave me my own flat from day one, but more importantly, they gave me a support worker who saw me as a whole person, not just a housing problem." The transformation component was perhaps the most innovative aspect of Future Hope. It recognized that helping young people secure stable housing was only the beginning. True transformation required addressing education, employment, mental health, relationships, and life skills. The program provided ongoing support for up to 3 years, helping young people build the foundation for long-term success. One of the most powerful advocates for this approach was David, a young man William had first met 5 years earlier. David had not only rebuilt his own life, but had become a peer mentor in the program, working with newly homeless young people to show them that change was possible. "The difference between this program and everything else I'd experienced," David said, "was that it treated me like someone with potential rather than someone with problems. Yes, I needed immediate help with housing, but I also needed to believe that I could create a different future for myself. The program gave me both." The business leaders in the room were initially skeptical about the cost and complexity of the Future Hope model. Traditional approaches to homelessness services focused on managing crisis as cheaply as possible. This new approach required significant upfront investment and longer-term commitment. However, the economic analysis that Williams' team had prepared was compelling. The research showed that the total cost of youth homelessness to society was enormous when all factors were considered. Emergency accommodations, repeated hospital visits, involvement with the criminal justice system, lost productivity, and social security payments meant that each young person who experienced chronic homelessness cost the taxpayer hundreds of thousands of pounds over their lifetime. In contrast, the intensive support provided by Future Hope, while expensive initially, resulted in significant long-term savings as young people became self-sufficient, productive members of society. Elizabeth, the CEO of a major consulting firm, had been asked to lead the business engagement aspect of the campaign. What convinced me to get involved, she said, wasn't just the moral argument, although that's compelling. It was the business case. We're talking about investing in young people who have incredible resilience and determination. When given the right support, they become extraordinary employees, entrepreneurs, and community leaders. The corporate engagement strategy was crucial to the success of Future Hope. Businesses would provide not just funding, but also employment opportunities, mentoring, and practical support. Young people in the program would have access to internships, apprenticeships, and entry-level positions with companies committed to supporting their success. The government ministers present at the meeting were cautious but interested. The political landscape around homelessness was complex, with responsibility split across multiple departments and levels of government. However, the comprehensive nature of Future Hope meant that it could demonstrate benefits across health, housing, education, employment, and criminal justice, making it attractive to politicians looking for solutions that crossed traditional departmental boundaries. Minister responsible for housing policy acknowledged the challenges. What you're proposing requires a level of coordination and long-term thinking that government doesn't always excel at, she said. But the current system isn't working. We're spending billions on crisis interventions that don't solve the underlying problems. If we can demonstrate that this approach works, I'm committed to exploring how we can scale it up. The meeting continued for over 4 hours, with detailed discussions about implementation, funding, evaluation, and political strategy. But it was the contributions from the young people present that kept bringing the conversation back to what really mattered, creating a system that recognized the dignity, potential, and humanity of young people experiencing homelessness. As the meeting concluded, William reflected on how far he had come since that first visit to 5 years earlier. He had evolved from a young man learning about homelessness to an informed advocate leading a movement for change. But he also recognized that this was just the beginning. Launching Future Hope was one thing. Making it work would require sustained effort, political courage, and the ongoing involvement of young people with lived experience. In the weeks following the launch meeting, William embarked on a series of visits across the country to build support for Future Hope. In each location, he met with local politicians, service providers, business leaders, and community members to explain the program and seek their involvement. The response was overwhelmingly positive, but William also encountered resistance from those who preferred traditional approaches or were skeptical about investing in comprehensive solutions. One particularly challenging meeting took place in a conservative constituency where the local MP was concerned about the cost of the program. William found himself having to make both the moral and economic case for investing in young people experiencing homelessness. He drew on all the research and real-world examples he had gathered over the previous 5 years to demonstrate that Future Hope wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the smart thing to do. I understand concerns about cost, William said during that meeting, but we need to think about what we're investing in versus what we're currently spending. Right now, we're paying enormous amounts to manage the consequences of youth homelessness, emergency services, temporary accommodations, criminal justice interventions, long-term social support. Future Hope is about investing in solutions that prevent those consequences from occurring in the first place. The MP was eventually convinced, but the conversation highlighted the ongoing challenge of building political support for preventative approaches. Politicians were often focused on immediate, visible results that could be achieved within electoral cycles. Future Hope required a longer-term perspective and faith in outcomes that might not be fully apparent for several years. Throughout this period, William continued to spend time with young people in the program. Their experiences and insights were crucial to refining the Future Hope model and making sure it remained grounded in the realities of youth homelessness. These conversations also provided William with the stories and examples he needed to make compelling arguments to skeptics. One young man who had a particular impact on William during this period was Jake, an 18-year-old who had entered the program after aging out of care. Jake was articulate and insightful about his experience, but he also struggled with the trauma of his childhood and the challenges of independent living. Working with Jake helped William understand that transformation wasn't a linear process. There would be setbacks and challenges even within the best support programs. "Some days I feel like I can conquer the world," Jake told William during one of their conversations. "Other days I feel like I'm drowning, but the difference now is that I'm not drowning alone. I have people who believe in me even when I don't believe in myself. They don't give up on me when I have a bad day or make a mistake. Jake's insight about the importance of persistence and unconditional support became central to how Future Hope operated. The program was designed to work with young people through the inevitable ups and downs of rebuilding their lives, providing consistent support even when progress seemed slow or when setbacks occurred. By the end of 2010, Future Hope had been launched in 5 pilot locations across England. Each site was working with approximately 50 young people, providing a real-world test of the model before considering broader expansion. The early results were encouraging, but William knew that the real test would come over the following years as the program matured and young people moved through the different phases of support. The launch of Future Hope marked a turning point in William's involvement with homelessness issues. He had moved from being an interested observer to being a leader in the field. His role was now about more than just raising awareness or providing charitable support. He was actively working to change systems and create new approaches to an old problem. As 2011 began, William felt a mix of excitement and responsibility. The launch of Future Hope had been successful, but now came the harder work of making sure the program delivered on its promises. The young people who had trusted him with their stories and hopes were depending on Future Hope to provide the support they needed to build better lives. The stakeholders who had committed time and money to the program were looking for evidence that their investment was worthwhile. The next phase of William's journey would be about turning vision into reality and proving that comprehensive, person-centered approaches to youth homelessness could work at scale. It would require patience, persistence, and continued learning, but William was more committed than ever to seeing it through. The small flat in Newcastle was nothing spectacular, just a one-bedroom space with basic furniture and a tiny kitchen. But for 20-year-old, it represented everything he had dreamed of during the 18 months he had spent sleeping rough. As Prince William sat at its kitchen table sharing a cup of tea, he could see the pride and hope in the young man's eyes. It was March 2015, and this visit marked 5 years since the launch of Future Hope. Had been one of the first young people to enter the program in Newcastle. His journey hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when it seemed like he might fall back into old patterns. But with consistent support and his own determination, had not only secured stable housing, but was now 3 months into an apprenticeship with a local construction company. "Your Highness," said, his voice filled with emotion, "5 years ago I thought my life was over. I was sleeping in doorways, getting moved on by police every night, and I couldn't see any way out. I was angry at the world and angry at myself. I never imagined I'd be sitting in my own flat, talking about my plans for the future." Story was one of hundreds that William had followed over the past 5 years. The Future Hope program had expanded from its initial 5 pilot sites to 37 locations across the UK. More than 3,000 young people had received support through the program, and the results were transforming how people thought about youth homelessness. The statistics were impressive. 87% of young people who completed the Future Hope program had maintained stable housing for at least 12 months after leaving the program. 73% were either in education, training, or employment. Mental health outcomes had improved dramatically, and involvement with the criminal justice system had dropped by over 60% among program participants. But for William, the real measure of success wasn't in the statistics. It was in the individual stories of transformation he witnessed every day. Young people like who had moved from desperation to hope, from isolation to connection, from survival to building meaningful lives. As William left his flat and walked through the streets of Newcastle, he reflected on how much had changed since those early days of learning about homelessness. The naive young prince who had first visited 10 years earlier had been replaced by an experienced advocate who understood the complexities of social policy, the importance of long-term investment, and the power of putting people with lived experience at the center of solutions. The success of Future Hope had brought William international attention as a leader in addressing youth homelessness. He had been invited to speak at conferences around the world, sharing the UK's experience and learning from innovative approaches being developed in other countries. These international connections had enriched the program and helped establish a global network of advocates working on similar issues. During a visit to Finland in 2013, William had seen firsthand how the housing-first approach had virtually eliminated rough sleeping in Helsinki. The Finnish model provided immediate access to permanent housing without requiring people to first prove they were housing-ready, through transitional programs. This approach had influenced the development of Future Hope and had contributed to its success in keeping young people in stable accommodation. In Australia, William had learned about innovative programs working with Indigenous young people experiencing homelessness. The Australian approach emphasized cultural connection and community-based solutions that recognized the specific challenges faced by Indigenous youth. This had inspired adaptations to Future Hope that better served young people from minority communities in the UK. Back home, the success of Future Hope had also brought challenges. The program's popularity meant that demand often exceeded capacity, and William found himself constantly advocating for increased funding and expansion. The political landscape had shifted over the 5 years since the program's launch, and new governments brought different priorities and approaches to social policy. One particularly difficult period came in 2012, when budget cuts threatened the program's funding. William found himself in the unusual position of having to lobby government ministers and make public statements about the importance of maintaining investment in prevention programs. It was a delicate balance, using his royal status to advocate for the program while remaining appropriately nonpartisan. The intervention came during a heated parliamentary debate about social spending. William had arranged to visit a Future Hope site in London on the same day, accompanied by several young people who had been helped by the program. The timing wasn't coincidental. William knew that the real-world impact of potential cuts needed to be visible to politicians making budget decisions. Among the young people on that visit was a 23-year-old who had experienced homelessness after fleeing an abusive relationship. Through Future Hope, she had not only secured safe housing, but had also completed her nursing degree and was working at a local hospital. Her story was featured prominently in media coverage of the visit, helping to illustrate what was at stake in the budget discussions. "The support I received saved my life," said during a television interview. "But more than that, it helped me build a life worth living. I'm now helping other people as a nurse, contributing to my community, paying taxes. That's the return on investment that people need to understand." The combination of William's advocacy, powerful personal stories, and compelling economic evidence eventually secured the program's funding. But the experience had taught William important lessons about the fragility of social programs and the need for sustained political engagement to protect innovations that were working. Throughout this period, William had also been developing his understanding of the broader systems that contributed to youth homelessness. He had become increasingly focused on prevention, recognizing that addressing the root causes of homelessness was more effective and more humane than providing crisis interventions after young people had already lost their housing. This led to the development of Future Hope Prevention, a program that worked with schools, care homes, and community organizations to identify young people at risk of homelessness and provide early intervention support. The prevention program focused on building life skills, providing emotional support, and creating safety nets that could catch young people before they fell into crisis. One young woman who benefited from this preventative approach whom William first met when she was 17 and still in care, had experienced multiple placement breakdowns and was approaching her 18th birthday with no family support and limited preparation for independent living. Under traditional approaches, would likely have been given a basic flat and left to sink or swim on her own. Instead, was enrolled in Future Hope Prevention while she was still in care. She worked with a dedicated support worker to develop practical life skills, built a network of adult supporters, and created a detailed plan for her transition to independence. When turned 18, she moved into her own flat but continued to receive intensive support for the first year. "The difference was that I never felt alone," explained to William during a visit 3 years later. "I knew I had people I could call when things got difficult. I had a safety net that meant I could take risks like going to college or trying for a job without worrying that one mistake would leave me homeless." Was now working as a youth worker herself, helping other young people navigate the transition from care to independence. Her journey from vulnerable care leaver to professional helper illustrated the transformative potential of early intervention and long-term support. As William watched the expansion and evolution of Future Hope, he was struck by how much he had learned about leadership and social change. The young prince who had initially thought that good intentions and hard work would be enough to solve complex problems had developed a sophisticated understanding of how change actually happened. He had learned about the importance of building coalitions, the need for political strategy, the value of evidence-based practice, and the crucial role of people with lived experience in designing and delivering services. He had also learned about patience, understanding that social change was a long-term process that required sustained effort and the ability to weather setbacks and challenges. One of the most significant developments during this period was the emergence of young people who had been helped by Future Hope as leaders and advocates in their own right. William had always insisted that the program should build the capacity of young people to speak for themselves rather than speaking on their behalf. By 2015, this approach was bearing fruit in remarkable ways. A group of Future Hope graduates had formed their own organization called Future Voices, which provided training and support for young people who wanted to become advocates for homeless youth. Future Voices members spoke at conferences, advised on policy development, and mentored other young people going through the program. Their emergence as leaders was one of William's proudest achievements. During a Future Voices conference in London, William listened as young people who had once been sleeping rough addressed an audience of politicians, service providers, and business leaders. Their speeches were articulate, passionate, and deeply informed by their lived experiences. They challenged assumptions, proposed solutions, and held powerful people accountable for their commitments to addressing youth homelessness. One speaker who particularly impressed William was Michael, a 24-year-old who had been homeless multiple times before entering Future Hope 4 years earlier. Michael had become a powerful advocate for changes to the benefits system that would better support young people transitioning to independence. "I'm not here to tell you a sad story about my past," Michael said to the conference audience. "I'm here to talk about the future we can create together. I'm here to tell you that homeless young people are not problems to be managed, but people with potential to be realized. I'm here to challenge you to think differently about what's possible." Michael's confidence and clarity illustrated how much had changed since the early days of Future Hope. Young people who had once been marginalized and voiceless had become articulate advocates capable of influencing policy and practice. This transformation was perhaps the most significant outcome of William's 10-year journey. As 2015 progressed, William found himself increasingly focused on the question of how to sustain and expand the progress that had been made. Future Hope had proven that comprehensive, person-centered approaches to youth homelessness could work, but the program still reached only a small fraction of the young people who needed support. The challenge was how to move from successful pilots to systemic change. This question became even more pressing as William began to take on additional royal duties and responsibilities. His marriage to Kate in 2011 and the birth of their children had brought new demands on his time and attention. He was committed to continuing his work on homelessness, but he also recognized the need to ensure that the movement could continue and grow beyond his direct involvement. The solution came through the establishment of the Future Hope Foundation, an independent organization that would take over the operation and expansion of the program. William would remain as patron and advocate, but the day-to-day leadership would be provided by a team of experienced professionals, many of whom had been involved in developing and implementing the program from its earliest days. The transition to the foundation model was carefully planned to ensure continuity and maintain the program's core values and approaches. Most importantly, the foundation was structured to ensure that young people with lived experience would have meaningful roles in governance and decision-making. The board of directors included several Future Hope graduates, and the organization committed to ensuring that people with lived experience would always make up at least half of its leadership team. As William prepared to step back from day-to-day operational involvement while maintaining his role as advocate and patron, he reflected on the incredible journey of the past 10 years. The naive idealism of his early visits had been replaced by sophisticated understanding of how to create sustainable change. The individual acts of charity had evolved into systematic approaches to prevention and transformation. Most importantly, the young people he had met along the way had taught him that ending youth homelessness was not just possible, but inevitable if society was willing to make the necessary commitments. Their courage, resilience, and wisdom had inspired not just William, but thousands of others who had become involved in the movement. The fourth phase of William's journey was coming to an end, but the movement he had helped to create was stronger than ever and ready for the challenges ahead. The morning sun streamed through the windows of James's palace as Prince William prepared for one of the most important speeches of his life. It was December 2025, exactly 20 years since his first transformative visit to. The venue was packed with over 500 people representing every aspect of the movement to end youth homelessness, from young people who had experienced homelessness themselves to government ministers, business leaders, and workers. But this wasn't just any anniversary celebration. Today, William would be announcing something that had once seemed impossible: the near elimination of youth homelessness in the United Kingdom. The journey had taken 2 decades, countless setbacks, moments of doubt, and unprecedented collaboration across society. Now, as he stood before the assembled crowd, William could see the faces of people whose lives had been transformed by this movement, and who had, in turn, transformed countless others. In the front row sat Sarah, the young woman whose words 20 years earlier had first challenged William to use his voice for homeless young people. Now 43, Sarah was the director of a major homelessness charity and had become one of the most respected advocates in the field. Beside her sat from Newcastle, now a successful construction company owner who employed dozens of people and had become a mentor to other young entrepreneurs. Scattered throughout the audience were hundreds of other young people whose lives had been changed by the programs and policies that had grown from those early conversations. As William approached the podium, he felt the weight of 2 decades of shared struggle and triumph. The young prince who had first walked into that shelter in 2005 could never have imagined the journey that lay ahead, or the extraordinary community of people who would join him along the way. 20 years ago, William began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall, I met a young woman named Sarah who told me that homeless people were invisible, that society looked through them as if they didn't exist. Today, I stand before you to announce that we have not only made homeless young people visible, we have made ending youth homelessness a reality. The applause was thunderous, but William raised his hand to continue. This achievement belongs not to me, but to every person in this room and thousands of others who refused to accept that any young person should have to sleep rough or live in unsafe conditions. It belongs to the young people who shared their stories, the workers who provided support, the politicians who made brave decisions, and the communities that opened their hearts and homes. The statistics William shared that morning were remarkable. Youth homelessness in the UK had been reduced by over 95% since 2005. More than 50,000 young people had been helped through various programs over the past 2 decades. The economic benefits were equally impressive. The investment in prevention and comprehensive support had saved taxpayers billions of pounds while transforming individual lives and entire communities. But the numbers, impressive as they were, only told part of the story. The real transformation had been cultural and social. Society's understanding of homelessness had fundamentally changed. Young people experiencing housing insecurity were no longer seen as problems to be managed, but as individuals with potential to be realized. The stigma that had once surrounded homelessness had been replaced by understanding, empathy, and practical support. The journey to this point had not been smooth or predictable. The expansion of future hope from those first pilot sites to a national program had faced numerous challenges. Economic recessions had threatened funding, political changes had required constant advocacy, and the program had to continuously evolve to meet changing needs and circumstances. One particularly difficult period had come in 2018, when a change in government brought new ministers who were skeptical of comprehensive support programs. William found himself once again having to make the case for long-term investment in prevention rather than short-term crisis management. The battle had been intense, involving public campaigns, parliamentary debates, and careful coalition building. The turning point had come when Future Voices, the organization of young people with lived experience, had organized a powerful campaign highlighting the economic and social benefits of the programs. Led by Michael, the young man who had spoken so eloquently at that conference years earlier, the campaign had mobilized thousands of supporters and demonstrated the political power of people who had been helped by the programs. We're not asking for charity, Michael had said during a televised debate with skeptical politicians. We're asking for investment in solutions that work. Every pound spent on comprehensive support saves 10 pounds in crisis interventions. Every young person who gets stable housing and support becomes a contributor to society rather than a drain on resources. The campaign had been successful, not only preserving the programs but actually expanding them. But more importantly, It had demonstrated the power of the movement that had been built over nearly 15 years. Young people who had once been marginalized and voiceless had become influential advocates capable of shaping policy and practice. The international dimension of the movement had also grown dramatically over the past decade. Williams' work had inspired similar initiatives in countries around the world, and a global network of advocates and practitioners had emerged. Cities from Melbourne to Helsinki, from Toronto to Tokyo, had implemented versions of the comprehensive support models pioneered in the UK. In 2022, William had addressed the United Nations General Assembly about youth homelessness, calling for a global commitment to ending this form of inequality. The speech had led to the adoption of a resolution committing member nations to work toward ending youth homelessness by 2030. It was a moment that the young prince from 2005 could never have imagined, but it felt like the natural evolution of a movement that had started with simple conversations in London shelters. The technological innovations of the past decade had also transformed how support was delivered to young people. Digital platforms allowed for more personalized and responsive services, while data analytics helped identify young people at risk before they became homeless. Artificial intelligence was being used to match young people with the most appropriate support services, and virtual reality was providing new ways to deliver life skills training and emotional support. But through all the technological advancement and policy innovation, the core insight that had emerged from those early visits remained central: the importance of treating each young person as an individual with unique needs, strengths, and potential. Technology and systems could provide the framework for support, but real transformation still happened through human relationships and genuine care. One young woman who embodied this principle was, whom William had first met in 2019 when she was 18 and had just aged out of care. Had faced multiple challenges. She was an immigrant with uncertain status, struggled with anxiety and depression, and had limited support networks. Under traditional approaches, would have been considered a high-risk case with poor prospects for success. Instead was matched with the young woman William had first met years earlier, who was now a senior support worker. Had seen something special in, and had worked patiently with her to address barriers and build confidence. With consistent support, had not only avoided homelessness but had excelled academically and was now studying medicine at university. "What saved me wasn't a program or a policy," had said during a recent interview. "It was having someone believe in me when I couldn't believe in myself. It was having consistent support that didn't disappear when I had a bad day or made a mistake. It was being treated like a person with potential rather than a problem to be solved." Story illustrated how the movement had maintained its human-centered approach, even as it had scaled up to serve thousands of young people. The programs had grown more sophisticated and efficient, but they had never lost sight of the fundamental truth that transformation happened through relationships and genuine care. As William's speech continued, he reflected on the personal transformation he had over the past 20 years. The experience of working on homelessness had shaped not just his public role, but his understanding of leadership, social change, and his responsibilities as a member of the royal family. "This work has taught me that real leadership isn't about having all the answers," William said to the assembled crowd. "It's about asking the right questions, bringing people together, and creating space for those most affected by problems to lead the solutions. The young people in this room and thousands of others have been my greatest teachers. They have shown me what courage looks like, what resilience means, and what's possible when we refuse to accept inequality as inevitable." The audience included many of William's teachers from over the years. Emma, who had shared her story in 2008, was now a senior policy advisor to the government. Jake, who had talked about the importance of persistence and unconditional support, had become a successful peer counselor helping other young people navigate mental health challenges. David, one of the first young people William had met, was now in his 40s and served on the board of the Future Hope Foundation. These relationships had sustained William through the most challenging periods of the work. When political opposition seemed insurmountable, when funding was threatened, when critics questioned whether comprehensive approaches were worth the investment, it was the voices and experiences of these young people that kept him focused on what really mattered. The transformation hadn't been limited to individuals. Entire communities had been changed by the presence of programs that treated vulnerable young people with dignity and invested in their potential. Neighborhoods that had once seen homeless young people as problems to be moved along now saw them as community members to be supported. Employers who had once been reluctant to hire young people with histories of homelessness now actively recruited them, recognizing their resilience and determination. One particularly powerful example was the transformation of a former industrial area in Manchester that had become a hub for innovative housing and support services. What had once been abandoned warehouses was now a thriving community where young people transitioning from homelessness lived alongside university students, young professionals, and families. The mixed community had created a model for how housing could be both affordable and inclusive. The development had been led by Tom, a young man who had experienced homelessness himself and had gone on to study architecture and urban planning. Tom's vision had been to create housing that broke down barriers rather than reinforcing them, where people with different backgrounds and experiences could support each other. Homelessness taught me about the importance of community, Tom had explained during the project's opening. When you're sleeping rough, you realize how much we all depend on each other. This development is about creating the kind of community where everyone has something to contribute and everyone belongs. As William's speech moved toward its conclusion, he turned his attention to the future. While youth homelessness had been largely eliminated, the work was far from over. The systems and programs that had been built needed to be maintained and strengthened. New challenges were emerging that required ongoing attention and innovation, and the broader fight against inequality and injustice continued. Today we celebrate an extraordinary achievement, William said, but we also recommit ourselves to the ongoing work of creating a society where every young person has the opportunity to thrive. We have proven that complex social problems can be solved when we bring together political will, sustained investment, and the leadership of those most affected by the challenges we face. The speech concluded with William announcing the next phase of the movement, an ambitious campaign to apply the lessons learned from ending youth homelessness to other forms of social exclusion and inequality. The infrastructure, relationships, and expertise that had been built over 2 decades would now be directed toward addressing educational inequality, youth unemployment, and mental health challenges. As the applause died down and people began to mingle, William found himself surrounded by young people whose lives had been touched by the movement. They were teachers and social workers, entrepreneurs and artists, parents and community leaders. They represented every possible path that life could take, united by their shared experience of having been supported through difficult times and their commitment to ensuring that other young people received the same opportunities. Sarah, the woman whose words had started William's journey 20 years earlier, approached him as the crowd began to thin. She handed him another handwritten note, just as she had done in that shelter all those years ago. "Your Highness," she said with a smile, "I wanted to give you this to mark the end of the beginning. 20 years ago, I challenged you not to let homeless young people be forgotten. Today, I want to thank you for ensuring that they will never be invisible again." William read the note later that evening. In it, Sarah wrote about the thousands of young people whose lives had been changed, the communities that had been transformed, and the society that had learned to see potential where it had once seen only problems. She ended with words that captured the essence of what had been achieved. "You asked us to trust you with our stories and our hopes. In return, you helped us write new endings to our stories and turn our hopes into realities. But more than that, you helped us discover that we had the power to change not just our own lives but the world around us. That might be the greatest gift of all." As William reflected on the journey from that first visit to this moment of celebration, he felt profound gratitude for all the people who had joined him along the way. The young prince who had been moved by the plight of homeless youth had become a man who understood that the most powerful force for change was the collective action of ordinary people committed to extraordinary goals. The fight to end youth homelessness had been won, but the broader struggle for justice and equality continued. Armed with 20 years of experience, a powerful network of allies, and the unshakable belief that change was possible, William was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The movement that had started with one young prince's determination to make invisible people visible had become a force capable of transforming society itself. As the evening ended, and William prepared to leave James's palace, he took one last look at the room where so many important conversations had taken place over the years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight He could celebrate with the thousands of people who had proved that when society commits to supporting its most vulnerable members, extraordinary things become possible. The 20-year fight to end youth homelessness was over. The fight for a more just and inclusive society was just beginning.